I want to give you guys a little guidance on how to proceed with your project. Okay, everyone's been given a project, and they're all very similar. They're exactly the same structurally, and that's largely due in part to me providing you with an application framework, right? So, part of what I want to accomplish in this overview or this guidance is to kind of guide you in how to approach the problem, right? Because there's a lot of stuff, and we haven't covered everything in class yet, right? But don't wait for me. You need to be proactive, and we're going to talk about that here in a second. All right. It's challenging, yeah, right? That's the point, okay? Um, but while everyone has a similar project, right, your data structure is different. If everyone's database is different, right? And by different, I mean you're going to be using the same database, but you're going to have a different data for your project. Like, for example, the name of everyone's project is different. I'm going to be showing you a project here called Collaborative Research Datasets and Curators, right? Whatever the name of your project is, it'll be in the project title. It'll be up at the top in bold and in the project title section, right? We'll talk about that in a second too. So I have provided all the answers that you will ever need, right, for this project. Example code in my repositories can show you how to do certain things. I've, have chapters up to chapter 23, which show you how to do exactly what I'm asking you to do, right? You need to be patient. You need to focus. You need to read those chapters, and you need to follow what those chapters are telling you to do, right? So yeah, you're going to learn some new things. You need to know enough about you don't need to be an expert. You need to know enough about relational databases in order to understand what they are, how to write simple queries, right? Make sure from the command line to test your database. Okay, we'll get to that. Your success on this project depends mostly on how your approach to problem solving, right? If you're a scatterbrain and you are panicking, you're not going to be successful. You need to go back and read chapter 4, I think it is, and see how you approach a project that you don't know all the answers to, right? I do that all the time. When someone says, hey, as a contractor, I'm asked to build software. And they'll say, hey, do this or do that. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm not really sure how to go about doing that. But guess what? I know how to approach the problem. And that's what I'm trying to teach you guys, right? How do you approach the problem? You need to be organized and methodical. And to that end, I will be checking your engineer's notebooks because as you solve each of these problems, your database connectivity, you're creating your tables, you should be making notes. You should be, writing how do you do certain things in your engineer's notebook. The first thing I'm going to ask you when you say, hey, I need help is, well, show me your engineer's notebook. What have you read? What have you done? What have you tried? Because if you haven't tried anything, if you haven't read anything, and you haven't got anything in your engineer's notebook, I cannot help you, right? Okay. Now, guess what? We haven't covered everything yet. But like I said, you need to be proactive. And there's chapters in the book I've provided that you can read that will get you up to speed. Now, there's a lot of moving parts, right? But you don't have to. What you need to do is know enough about a certain thing and write that how to do that in your engineer's notebook so that when you have to do it again, you don't have to go back and relearn it, right? And a lot of that has to do with your repository and pipiv because that's a virtual environment, right? And then, once you get the hang of things, it'll be obvious what you need to write. Now, sample project. Let me bring over the sample project. Okay, so here, this is a typical project, right? Like I said, everyone has the same project, but your data will be different. So, for example, this collaborative research, right? This is the example that I have in front of me. Everyone's going to have a different title. So what is your task? Your task is to build or design and build a console-based, multi-layered, data-driven application. Well, I've designed the application architecture for you, and we'll cover that here in a second. What you need to design are your data structures for the database, okay? Figure out what fields or columns goes in those tables. You need to create your many-to-many relationship between those tables. And guess what? All that's covered in a chapter in the book. So then, project description is kind of just like just a very brief, terse statement on what the project is from regards of the data sets, right? Data sets are curated, in this case, right? It says data sets curated by many curators, and curators manage many data sets with roles and curation dates. So some of this description, this very brief description, should give you some ideas, right? And you need to use some imagination here too, right? On what types of data might go into each of the tables. Now, when you read chapter 23, you'll understand what a table is and a database. So here's the primary database entities, right? So I've got data set and curator. Now, these entities won't just necessarily be used in the database, they'll be used within the application as well, right? But I haven't covered data classes yet, so we're going to cover that in the upcoming weeks, all right? But you can say that these are two of the tables in your database, and this one down here is your third table. This is your cross-reference table. So at the very least, and you don't need any more than these for this project, you have a database table called dataset and a database or dataset. Usually it's plural when you create the table because the table contains many of these things, right? So you'd have one datasets and it'd be lowercase. And then you'd have another table curators, and curators would be, I'm just guessing at this point, right? Like I don't have a whole lot of experience with collaborative research data sets, but my guess is there's data sets out there that have been assembled for research purposes, right? And guess what? You can look up on the internet, like, oh, here's what I got to do. Here's what my database has to be. Let me go do some research on the internet to see if there's anything that will give me a hint on how I could structure this stuff. You don't have to be very complex. You just have to capture enough of the problem domain so that you can create the application and make database queries, right? I'm not asking you to design a full-blown application. I'm asking you to learn some new tricks, right? Okay, so then the cross-reference table, again, this is a database table that the name, right? Cross-ref that's what I use, right? Other designers or software engineers might choose to name their tables differently, but this is how you would relate a data set to a curator, especially if a curator can curate many data sets and different data sets can have the same curator, right? So that's called a many-to-many relationship. Again, you got to read chapter 23, right? So what have I provided? I provided the application framework, which provides logging, configuration, application settings, and an application base class, right? So how do you get there? It's in my repository, right? So you click on this link. I'm going to allow it. It takes you to my GitHub page where this repository is. So you need to know enough about GitHub and repos, and then you got to clone this repository to your local machine because you're going to copy. You see this folder here, the app framework folder. You're going to copy the contents of this folder into your projects folder, right? All right. And we covered that in class on Monday, the 20th, all right, of October. Now, the other thing I'm going to provide are bash script examples so that you can automate various aspects of database initialization, right? I'll go over this stuff next week in class, all right? But there's examples in my repositories. You might say, well, where are these examples at, right? So let me go back. I should have not closed that, right? So I'm going to go back to GitHub, Paul Free Press. All right, so pick a repo. I would say go to the IT-566 computer scripting, all right? And there's others. Go to the Python folder, all right? And then go to, the best one I think is probably clean architecture because, hey, guess what? Does that picture look familiar, right? You got a database, you got a MySQL persistence wrapper. This is a little bit more complicated. The structure of the app framework doesn't have this abstract base class, and I did that not so that you weren't too confused, right? This can be a little confusing as to why we might want to use this, right? And it has to do with software patterns and factories, which we're not using, right? So anyway, you're going to have a main. You have a main.py in the architecture, and we'll go over that in a second. Presentation layer, logic layer, business logic layer, and the MySQL persistence wrapper, right? Okay, so in this example, there in the database, right? I've got version databases, so when I go over this stuff next week, I'm going to show you how to do this. And then there's this initialize database script, right? So here's an example of when you get your database scripts created and they work and you test them, you can automate calling them by looking at this example here, all right? Now you go back, the next script is this build.sh. It looks like complicated, but it's really quite simple. And this is how you would run your app, initialize your database, call the initialize database script from a central location, right? So guess what? How this thing is structured is covered in my book in chapter 11, right? Bash build script. So you need to read chapter 11 if you want to understand how this build script works. All right, I'll set this aside. All right, so I've given you, right, a project framework, and then required, you must make regular commits to your repository. I recommend making a commit after each programming session, right? Like if you're working on your database scripts and you got your scripts working, commit them to your repository, push them to your remote repository. Because I'm going to ask, show me your work, right? Show me what you've been working on. Because at the end of the semester, if you come up with a completed project and there's no commit history, I'll just assume that, there's no thing called magic, right? You just magically came up with this whole thing with no incremental work. That's a sure way of not doing very well on the project, right? All right, so we went over the project. Everybody's database will be different. They'll have different data in it, right? So like I said, the key is chapter 23. So let's go to the next slide here. Now, how to proceed, right? The first thing you need to do is set up your project, working from left to right. So set up your project. We went over that on the 20th, on Monday, right? Work on the database. So once you get your project set up and you can run it, right, then you're going to work on the database. Now, you work on the database, essentially what you're going to find, right, is you'll probably spend most of your time with a week. I would say no more than a week or two, right, because you're going to run out of time if you dilly-dally here, right? You work on the database, you get the database to a point where then you can proceed to work on the persistence layer, right? So what does it mean to work on the database? We're going to go over that. Then work on the persistence layer. That's Python code. All right. So here you're not working on any Python code. You're just like getting the database created, working on your database scripts, making sure you can run those database scripts. And the reason why you want to do that is because as you develop, like once you move to here, part of your database scripts will insert test data into your database. And you need test data because if you're going to do a query, you need to, like a select statement into your database, you need to be able to get data back from that select statement, right? All right, so once you got your database to a point where you can proceed, then you can work on your persistence layer. Then once you get the persistence layer working, you need to test that, and I'll show you how you can do that. And then work on the service layer. And once you get your service layer, which is really kind of easy, right? Like there's not a whole lot that we're doing in the service layer, but it's there for a reason, right? And unfortunately, this project is not necessarily so complicated as the reason becomes obvious, right? But the service layer is there to perhaps access different databases, right? Like let's say you had multiple databases that this application needed. Well, you'd have multiple persistence layers and they would all come together in the service layer, right? That's just one example. There are hundreds. Then you work on the presentation layer. Once you get the service layer working, once you work on the database, right? Work on the persistence layer, get a little bit of the service layer done, then work on the presentation layer. And this is where you would actually have an application running, right? So what would that look like? Okay, I'm going to start a program called MAMP, all right, just to give you a demonstration of what the presentation layer would look like. I'm going to start MAMP here. Got to find MAMP Pro is what I use, right? All right, so this is MAMP, all right, on a Mac. It looks a little different on Windows. I'm going to start it. Okay. And then I'm going to, I just need to start my database. All right. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate to a project. All right. So I'm going to open up my terminal. And I'm going to go to that clean architecture, right? So I'm going to go to CD. Let me make this bigger so you can see it. All right. Let me make this bigger so you can see it. All right. So CD, dev, right? I put everything in my dev folder. And I'm going to go to CD dev.classes. CD IT-566 computer scripting. CD Python. CD clean architecture. All right, now I'm here. I do a dir. I've got this build script, right? And if I just type /build, right, it'll tell me how to run my project, right? And so, I want to initialize the database. All right, so initialize database. So to run it, I go /build.sh, initialize database. So /build -- initialize _ database, right? And then you should see database scripts run, and they do. So dropping the database, dropping the user, creating the database, creating the user, creating tables, inserting test data. This is version 1 of the scripts. And in this particular example, I'm showing how to create, like, incrementally change your database. Not required for this project, but I'm doing it on this particular example. And then I'm running another set of scripts. All right. Now I can run my app. So if I go back to /build, it'll tell me, how do I run my app? Run main. And this will run. So in the comments over here, past these hashtags, it shows you what it's going to do. pipiv run Python 3 source main, right? So I'm going to say /build and then run main. Boom. So this is the presentation layer. And it's just a console-based application. Now for this example, right, I used to give this project out. And I don't do it for different reasons. Because, and this is going to sound mean, right? But it's true. Everybody gets the same project. Everybody starts sharing the code. And then you can't figure out who's actually doing the work and who's cheating, right? So I want individual effort. But in this particular case, you can use this code for an example on like how to assemble this stuff, right? So new inventory is not implemented, but list inventories is, right? So you can see 2, right? Hit 2, hit return, and it goes to the database, right? Grabs the data and brings it back and displays it in a pretty table, all right? And then press any key to continue. And now if we want to select an inventory, select it. Oh, there's one inventory. So hit the ID from the list. So we're going to select inventory 1. Is this correct? Yes. And then, okay, now we've selected the inventory. Now list inventory items, hit 4. Okay, so this app is very rudimentary, right? The user interface could be a lot more helpful to kind of show you which inventory you've selected. But that's not the point. The point is that you're making calls back to the database, right? Your app don't have to be perfect. You're displaying data in the front end. All right. So this is the purpose of the build script is to automate running the application, giving you convenience features, right? To like initialize the database, drop and create the database whenever you need to, if you modify it, because you're going to be testing things like you're going to be creating records and deleting records. And at some point, you're going to be like, you know what? I just want to reset the database back to its original form, right? With a fresh set of test data. So you run your initialized database, right? So if I exit here, right, and I do /build dash initialize base, right? Boom. It'll just rerun the scripts and your database is back and recreated. So that's an example. All right. So you work on your database, work on your persistence layer. Now let's start with setting up your project, right? I'm not going to re-go through everything I did on Monday, but this is essentially what we covered. You need to set up your project. So to set up your project, you need to create your GitHub account if you have not already done that. And I think most people in class did it in class, right? Or it was already done. Now, you need to read chapter 7 and 8. That'll tell you how to do that. We cover this stuff in class on 20 August. I'm not covering this stuff again, right? Like I don't have time. You don't have time. We don't have time to rehash things if you've missed class, right? You need to catch up. Clone your project repository to your local machine, right? So you're going to create a repository in GitHub for your project. Then you're going to clone it to your local machine in your dev folder someplace, right? Then you're going to clone my application framework to your local machine, and you're going to copy the application framework files to your project directory. You're going to change the name of the project, which I talked about on Monday. And then create your virtual environment with pipiv, and then run the project and fix any errors. So here's what it should look like, right? I will run this. So I'm going to navigate to, all right, at this point, right, you don't have any database stuff, and there's no build script yet, so we'll add that later. But I'm going to go to CD. Okay, so just go up here. See how many directories I got to go up. 3. All right, dir. Can't type. Yeah. So you see this line right here, IT-566 project app framework. That's the repo you want to clone for the app framework, right? So I'm going to change directory to the app framework. IT-566 app framework. So here's what it looks like. Well, that's not the way it looks. This is just the repo, right? So I need to go to the app framework folder. It's the contents of this app _framework folder. This is what you want to copy, not this. Well, you won't have a venv, right? But you will create it with pipiv. It consists of the app settings, JSON, the config directory, the database, logs, pip file and pip file lock perhaps, and the source, right? Now, once you have this, right, what's the first thing you should do? The first thing you should do is when you copy it into your project is run it. Okay, I recommend try to run it first. And how do you run it? The first thing you need to do is do a pip env. If you haven't created your virtual environment, let me delete this virtual environment. So let me say rm -rf, right, .venv. All right, so this is how you would, I'm sorry. Was there some error there? I didn't see that. Oh, .venv. Okay, so rm -rf .venv. All right, dir. All right. So app settings, config database, pip file lock. All right. Now I'm going to get rid of the pip file because that's probably not in there, right? So let me get rid of that. rm pip file and rm pip file.lock, right? So I think this is what you get. If you have a pip file, great, you can use it. All right, so app settings, config. If we do a tree, we'll see that this is the contents of this. We have an application name. This is what I'm saying. You got to change the name of this stuff, right? You got to change, like, for example, if I was doing this project here, I would probably change it to collaborative research datasets, right? As my project name, right? Or my application name. So everywhere you see application name, you want to change that to your project's name. And you don't have to make it long. You can make it short. All right. This is fine. That's fine. Right. But you'll see that you have to change the contents of these modules as well. All right. Because they are referencing this folder structure. You got to change the name of that folder to your project. Okay. Name. And these all be the same. Right. You're going to change everywhere you see application name, even in the code. So for example, if I go to application base, if I do a cat on the application name, application, oh, source, I'm sorry, no wonder I can't see it. src slash application name, application base, right? If I cat this, and you'll see up here that it tries to import application name logging, right? And so when you change the name of this folder application name, then it's not going to be able to find the logging file, right, which is right here, because you've changed the name of this folder. When you change the name of this directory, you're going to have to go into each of these files and change the name of this to whatever the name of your that you changed it to. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So, all right, so everyone has to do that, and I'm going to be checking on that next week to make sure everyone's done this. All right, but before you do that, right, you can try to run this, and the way that you do it is you make sure pipiv installed, and that is covered in chapter. Pipiv is covered in chapter 10, right? So you read chapter 10, and then you would say pipiv, right? Dash Python, and I'll say 3.12, right? Whichever version of Python you're using, greater than 3.10, you have to have that installed on your machine. But we run this, it creates the virtual environment. Now when we do a dir or a ls, right, we see that we have a .venv, and it creates a pip file. Now we're going to need to install so that pip file. So we're going to need to install. Let me go to chapter 23, right? Because this shows you how to do it. Go to chapter 23. Let me open chapter 23. All right, so here we are, chapter 23. I want to come up here to installing. All right, so chapter 23 says, let me make this bigger. All right, first things first, to connect to your database, you need to install this Python, MySQL connector Python. All right, so how do you do that? So it shows you right here, install it. So you create your pipiv environment, and then you go pipiv install MySQL connector Python. All right, so we're going to do that. Pipiv install MySQL connector Python. All right, pipiv my right SQL dot connector Python. Hit return, and it installs it. All right. And where does it tell you that this has been installed? So if you do a cat on your pip file, it'll show you here that, oh, you've installed this package, MySQL connector Python, whatever version, right? Also, too, whatever version of Python you're using, it'll specify here the full version, right? So evidently on my machine, I've got Python 3.12.11, right? And you can check that. Well, I don't have to check it. I know that's the case. All right. So now, how do you then run the application? Well, you run the application by running the main, right? So you go pipiv run Python. You can just use Python even on a Mac, right? Python source / main. All right. And then in this particular app requires a config file. So we're going to say -c and then config / app, because we're not changing, we haven't yet changed the name of the project, right? We're just testing everything. So it's going to read in that config file, and this is what it should see. If you see this, then everything is configured correctly, right? Like you got your pipiv installed, right? We're not doing any database connection stuff at this point, right? This is just the configuration, which has to be changed when you actually create your database. But what we're testing here is the logging, the fact that it reads the configuration file, and tracing the creation of the different objects like the MySQL wrapper, the service layer, and the presentation layer, right? So at this point, you want to change the name of the directory to your application name. Open it up in Visual Studio Code. Everywhere you see application _name, change that to your application's name, right? And then you run it. And if there's any errors, you got to track down those errors and fix those errors until you get it to run and it produces this output. That's what I'm saying. At that point, your project is set up. Okay? At that point, your project is set up. Then once you get your project set up, right, the next thing you want to do, this is the architecture, right? So you're going to have MySQL database running in MAMP, or for Mac and Windows, it'll be MAMP. All right. For Linux users, you have to install Apache, which usually comes installed depending on your variant that you use, right? Apache, MySQL, and Chapter 22 walks you through how to install all that stuff on Linux, right? On Ubuntu or Debian-based Linux, right? If you're using something besides Debian, then you're on your own, but it's not hard. If you're running Linux, I assume you know how to do that stuff, right? So this shows you what the structure of what you have in front of you consists of: a presentation layer, a service layer, and a persistence layer. We haven't yet talked about the infrastructure layer, which we will in the coming weeks, all right? Now, the next thing you want to work on once you get your project set up is the database, all right? You need to install and configure MAMP. All right. You need to install and configure, if you're on Windows and Mac. If you're on Linux, you need to install and configure Apache, MySQL, PHP. You need to install this according to Chapter 22, and you need to be able to run MySQL client from the terminal. All right. If you come to class and you say, I haven't installed my database, can you help me? The first thing I'm going to say is, show me your engineer's notebook. Show me where you tried to do it. Right? Because if you haven't tried to do it, then I'm going to send you packing and you got to go try it, right? That's how you learn stuff. Then you need to read Chapter 23. You need to study relational database fundamentals, right? Because most of you probably don't have any clue. Then you're going to start working on your database, tables and relationships. That's also covered in Chapter 23. Then you're going to create your database scripts. That's covered in Chapter 23. You don't want to take more than 2 weeks to get your database in a state where you can start working on the presentation on the persistence layer. I consider this database piece, right, probably the most challenging, because once you get one of your methods working and you see a successful query in your MySQL persistence layer, then there's some copy paste, but once you see one thing working, right, then you're like, oh, I get it, right? And you're going to go, let's go back to this slide here. You're going to struggle here. Set up your project. You get the project set up. You're going to struggle here because you're learning a lot of new concepts. You're initially going to struggle here until you get something running, and then the light bulb's going to pop on, and you're going to be off like a shot. Now, you might scratch your head on the service layer, but when you realize how easy that is, the only thing else that's going to give you some issues is the presentation layer. All right? But there's examples out there, especially that clean architecture example. All right? So, that's the database, right? So make sure you get your database. Then once you get your database working, let's just say that you only got one table in your database and you want to try to query that table from your persistence layer. That's great, right? Because that's not a bad way to proceed, right? And what you're going to be doing though is you're going to be iterating between, like, okay, I'll get the main table working, maybe two of the regular tables working, and then I'll worry about connecting them up with the cross-reference table later, right? That's totally viable approach, right? And then let's say you create one of your database tables with representative columns for data. You add some test data to that table, and then you move to the persistence layer. You're going to add configuration database settings to your config file, because that's how your database, that's how Python in the persistence layer is going to be able to create the pooled connections. Then you're going to uncomment some code. Let me show you what I'm talking about. If we go to this framework, right, and I do code dot, then in the persistence layer, the MySQL persistence wrapper, let me make this bigger. There's this is your init method, right? And then the actual, this line of code here, this is just a comment, but this is a comment too, but this line of code is what creates your database pool, right? And then it's not, and then this, yeah, so this is what you would have to uncomment, is just, you'd have to do this and that, right? Because this function, this method down here is what gets run when the application gets loaded, right? When you create an instance of this class, right, in the service layer, right? Then it's going to run this. But this is commented out because until you get your database configuration settings entered into your config file, that's going to throw an error and nothing's going to work, right? So anyway, that's what I mean by uncomment the code, right, in the persistence wrapper. Run the app to test the database connection, all right? So I don't have the database connection set up here, so I'm not going to do that, but I'll do it on Monday because I'm going to talk about this stuff in Monday's class, right? And then you start by adding basic SQL queries, right? Start by querying one table. Add a corresponding method to the class to execute that query, and then test the persistence layer in the main module. Don't try to code everything. Focus on getting one method to work so you experience success. Let me tell you, that's a real dopamine hit when you get this stuff working, all right? And that's it for this particular project guidance session. So, like I say, make sure you're studying these chapters. The answers are there. Make sure you're entering the gouge in your engineer's notebook. All right? And good luck. See you in class on Monday.